Good afternoon and welcome to yet another TUG Connects 365 webinar today. I'm Gloria Nelson, your host with TUG. And as you settle in and get ready for the start of today's webinar, let me give a brief introduction for TUG, the usergroup.org, for both our current members and those of you who represent organizations that have not yet joined our online community of info distribution software users. And we've all heard the phrase that knowledge is power, and I can say with confidence that after today's presentation, you'll be waking up tomorrow with a little more of both. TUG webinars, online forums, and member events facilitate the timely exchange of ideas and information to help you work smarter and with more confidence. Now that's a powerful combination. And a quick heads up, TUG Connects 2021 virtual conference registration is now live. So head on over after the webinar and make sure you register today. If you're currently a member, it also pays to get even more involved. And if you're not, please visit our website to discover why 2,300 heads are better than one to help you be the best at what you do. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Della Coffelt, CIO of Distributors Corp of America and TUG board member, who is going to be your moderator this afternoon, along with our esteemed panelists that she'll be introducing shortly. We're going to be drilling deeper into cybersecurity as we continue to many of us work from home. So Della, I'm turning things over to you. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Gloria. I want to thank everyone for attending today's panel discussion. The pandemic has really introduced us to a whole new work environment. And from everything that I'm reading and hearing from other people, this whole idea of work from home is really here to stay. It's here to stay at some level. And that means security has got to be foremost in our minds. If you don't think about cybersecurity, it's like not locking your door when you leave your house. So it has to be very front and center of every IT department. We've assembled a panel of experts. We have Peter Billson, Director of IT at Turtle & Hughes, Jim Spellos, President of Meeting You, John Toepfer, Client Service Manager of ACO Insurance Group, and Brian Weaver, VP of Sales at NSA. So there's a number of ways of interacting with this panel. You can post a question. If somebody else has posted a question that you like, go ahead and like it. It'll raise it to the top. And you have a chat box that's available as well. So before we get this started, we want to ask a question. So Gloria, if you'd open up the poll for us. So how many of you are planning or plan to have people at your company working from home at the end of the summer? It's a given that we're working now, but what about by the end of the summer? So if you would go ahead and answer that poll, I'll give you just a moment to do that. And then we'll see the answer here, and we'll have an answer here in just a moment. And I am assuming that there's some people that are working from home now, but it's really looking at the future of where we're going to be at the end of this summer. The vaccine is coming out. It's going to change that work environment. So let's take a look at this. Sorry, I got to see this. We've got about 50% saying yes, 20% no, and about 30% are not sure. So it's still kind of up in the air. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you very much. To start us off, I'm going to turn this over to Jim Spellos.
Della, thank you so much and welcome everybody. It is a pleasure to be here, and I love the analogy that Della gave about not locking the front door, as we can see on the screen. That's the image we have here. Got 10 minutes to cover your basic strategies, but first, you're working from home. So let's be really clear on this. We have a new IT department for you. And I know you've seen them, I know you're comfortable with them, but just in case, let's just be sure that we're comfortable and understanding about IT, which is different from your old IT department. Maybe that's not what they look like, and no offense to anybody there. But the bottom line is that you're more on your own than you ever were in this situation of keeping yourself safe and secure. So what we need to be able to do is understand that all the issues that we're having right now are not IT issues. There are issues that are happening to everyone, and certainly the events of the past year and the pandemic have changed the game and have just expedited all of that so quickly. So we want to make sure that as we have the beginning of this conversation, we talk about strategies and approaches and give you as much data as you need. Couple of stats before we get into just drilling down a little bit further. A hack attack happens less than once a minute. Every 39 seconds is the latest stat I've seen. I see it all over the board, but I think it just gives you the basic information that you need to know that they're happening all the time. And the downloading of apps outside of the Google Play or the Apple Store is where most malware hits your mobile devices. So it's not just from what's happening in the Google Store, and clearly there's an issue, and there are some apps that are out there that do have malicious software in the Android Google infrastructure, but you're more likely to have a problem if you're going around that. The phishing websites, massive increase, and I think all of these stats come into one final piece of information, which is most of these problems are because of, because of you and me. They're not because of IT necessarily, it's because of someone does something very simple within the organization that causes it. So what type of attacks are we talking about, especially from home? We're going to break this down very quickly into two different types, what I'm going to call the in-home attacks and then the work from anywhere attacks. Very easy to take the first category and lump it into the title of social engineering. What does that mean? Essentially, it means that you're being attacked and you're doing something without any influence other than a verbal influence. You're not actually being, sent information. You're being asked for your information and you're giving it up willingly. We're comfortable with phishing attacks, although more than that in 1 second, the whaling attack becoming more and more frequent for corporations. All that is a phishing attack that is actually directed toward the big honcho of the organization, hence the name. But let's get into the phishing attacks, and I want to show you 3 possible attacks. I'm calling them possible. I've gotten all of these, and in chat, all I want you to put in there is either real or phishing. So first one we're going to show, and these will have all come at some point into my inbox in the past year. This one from Netflix. Your account has been suspended. It sends you the information. The email lets you know your credit card has been expired. To update your account information, please visit your account with a link there. Real deal or phishing? I hope nobody in here thinks that's the real deal. That is a classic phishing scam, but it's really simplistic. It's the sort of thing that you and I are all going to figure out. But let's take another one here. And this one came from one of my chiropractor's office. And look at the basic information in the email. There's no person it's to, there's no text in there, and there's a document. Real deal or phishing scam? You see, my spidey sense comes up anytime I see a document anywhere or a link without any of the text. I am not clicking on it. So I went to my chiropractor a few days later, and it was legit. And we had a long conversation. This is dangerous. How we send emails out, also, we need to make sure that we are clear when we send communications, who it's coming from, and that it is legitimate, because I, for one, not going down that path. Those 2, basic. Here's the one we need to worry about. This came in just after the pandemic started. Okay, urgent message from New York State Department of Labor. And it tells me to sign in using my NYGov account. And goodness knows, I'm not falling for this. Come on, really? They have a space problem here. But what I decided to do was I decided to check on that link and compared it to the actual link. And goodness knows, it was pretty close when you think about it. In fact, the top level domain, the NY before the .gov, was the same. So now I'm scratching my head. I'm going, well, maybe this is legit. So I went to the other one and I see that it is different as well, but not substantially. And then my wife and I discussed, and she goes, well, you better reach out to them. I go, no, this can't be legit. But it was. So you see, even with good sensing and a good sense of caution, sometimes we're just missing that whole approach. 4 words, think before you click. Anything you get, don't click that link if you're not 140% sure that it's legit. Now, What else in terms of in-home attacks? Well, we have the file-less attacks. And what we're talking about there is pretty straightforward. Leveraging what's already on your computer. IT has told you for years to disable macros in Office. Now, I write macros, so I hate when I hear that, but I understand it because it's so easy within a macro of Excel or Word to transmit a virus or a piece of malicious software. PDF files, JavaScripts, add-a-date tools, browser extensions. You better be on your best behavior and your highest alert to be able to make sure that you're not doing something that's going to compromise your organization. Remember, the problem isn't just going to be on your computer, because if it is ransomware, as Brian's going to talk about later, it has massive implications for your organization. What else? What about drive-by hacking? You kind of laugh at that, right? Who's somebody sitting outside your house checking into your router? Or maybe they're finding your IoT, you know, the Google Nest that you got, or the Wemo lights. Let's face it, is your router secure? Have you changed the password on there and made it really, really, really tight to get into? We'll talk more about passwords in a second. But guess what? These are open places for people to easily get into, whether it's a drive-by hacking or it's someone 10,000 miles away. Lastly, any sort of apps you put in that side load that avoid the main Apple Store, Android Store, don't do. Okay, when you start moving out of the home, you go to your favorite coffee shop maybe to get some work done. Let's be aware, man-in-the-middle attacks. Somebody's sitting in the coffee shop and he or she may look pleasant enough, but they're actually taking the internet that you're accessing and are in the middle, seeing everything that you're typing before it gets out to the internet. That's a man-in-the-middle attack. You need to have encryption. And again, when we get to the solutions in a sec, we'll talk about that. A fake wireless network. Starbucks 1, Starbucks 2, that's always a red flag for me to be really aware of. When we start using airports, again, you see from the picture, you have the power cord, then you have the USB. Don't use the USB. That's called juice jacking. It's very easy to put malware in there. And clearly, don't get a USB from somebody else. Please, please, please. Just not a good idea for your security. So as we wrap up the last few minutes, solutions, fivefold. I want to give you a 5-tier protection. Number one, simple antivirus. I know people are going to throw darts at me for saying this, but I think this is the least important of the 5 tiers that we're going to talk about right here. We all probably have it on their computer. By the way, if you have a Mac, it is built in, but I don't think it's a bad idea to have your own antivirus on top of there as well, as long as it plays nicely with the Mac. Anti-malware, really, really useful. I use Malwarebytes. I'm not going to recommend any product. I will tell you what I use, and I make sure that my malware is always being checked. So if some file comes into me before it ever gets onto my hard drive, it is being scanned, and if there's a problem, it is being quarantined. Number 3, a VPN, a virtual private network. This is what's going to encrypt your data from the point you're at to getting out to the servers beyond that local person in the coffee shop who's preying on you in the man-in-the-middle attack. Passwords. Just do me a favor. We don't have all day to talk about this. Yes or no in the chat box. Use a password manager. We'll get back to that in a second. And as we do the 5th of the 5 areas, 2FA, 2-factor authentication. This way, if your password is stolen, which unfortunately it probably will be at some point, they still need your device. Options, Google Authenticator and Authy, 2 good mobile and or desktop solutions for you. I'm always using the 2FA generator within Facebook as well for all of this. So 0 day, if you get an annoying opportunity to restart your computer in the middle of your work, guess what? It's probably addressing a security flaw based on what is called a 0-day attack, which means the bad guys have an in to your operating system that the good guys, in this case Microsoft, is trying to fix. So when you do see those security enhancements and updates, I know they're the pain. I know they've caused problems sometimes, but it's a real good idea to be able to say yes to that. So is this your approach? Was it that open back door to your security? Let's end, before I give it back to Della, with a top 10 list. And that top 10 list is the last year's most used passwords. Here we go. Number 10, Senha. What does that mean? It took me a while to figure it out. I'll let you know when we get to number 4. Number 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Number 8 on the list is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because that's easier to remember. Number 7 is 1, 2, 3. These are legit. These are the top 10 passwords people use. Number 6 is 6 ones, frustrating as anything. Number 5 goes up to 8. Number 4, the word password, what Senha means from Portuguese. So now we understand where that's coming from. Number 3, picture 1. And I clearly don't understand where that came from, but don't use it. Number 2 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And the number 1 password, and by the way, do not put in chat if you use any of these passwords. I don't want to know. But with over 2.5 million uses is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Della, help me on this. Any questions about this?
Oh my goodness. What about the word incorrect? That way, when it comes back, it tells you your password's incorrect, and you always know what your password is.
That's why you need the password manager. You need to have that, so you're not always trying to struggle and use the same password again and again and again.
Yeah, that is one thing. I mean, we try to educate our users on, you don't use the same password in business as you do in personal. And we've forced everybody to move to a passphrase. So it has to be long. It has to be something that they will recognize, that they will easily remember. Because the other big thing is how many people have their passwords written down.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. The smartest man I've ever met in my life had all of his passwords written down in little sticky notes all around his computer screen. It was like, I love you and you're really, really smart, but you know, when there's 50 passwords, you don't remember them all. So yeah, there's tough. Do you have a password tool that you recommend?
I'll tell you what I use. I stay away ever from recommending, but for 5, 6 years now, I've used Dashlane. And Dashlane has always been the tool that allows me to have the one master password. And then I don't know my other passwords. Now, the one other tool that I know a lot of people like that's gotten some really bad press lately is LastPass because of some of their anti-privacy functionality. But LastPass, which is even less expensive than Dashlane, I think maybe only like $10 a year, has time and time again done a great job. But for me, Dashlane's the tool, and I have it on my desktop, I have it on my laptop, I have it on my mobile devices as well.
Yeah. And that is one thing that I always try to tell people. It's like, it's not just your computer that we have to worry about. It is your phone, and it is every other device that you have, because they all can connect to our network. And so we need to manage all of those. Even if you own them, we don't.
Yeah, and that's the thing people don't realize. It's any point of entree is a point where it can affect the entire organization.
Yep, absolutely. I have one last question for you, and it really isn't necessarily cybersecurity, but in the world of collaboration, do you have any collaboration tools that you use that you know are safe?
It was perfect until you know we're safe. You know, that was the perfect, easy question to be able to answer. I use Slack. I use Teams sometimes, and I'm pretty sure it is safe, but any network is nothing more than the weakest link. So if somebody exposes a password of Slack because they have it on a sticky note on their computer, it's problematic. I think a lot of the applications, including Zoom, had gotten a lot of heat a year ago. Especially with their protection and their passwords and the issues they were having. And I believe they've all sort of stepped up the game, but it's a cat and mouse game. So I never want to say anyone's 100% good because there's always people looking to find a way around it. So just be on your best behavior always.
Yep. Well, good point. Good point.
So
Thank you.
I'm going to pass it over to John Toepfer, who's going to talk about risk of cybersecurity. John, take it away.
Good afternoon. Thanks. I appreciate you turning that over to me, Jim. I'm here today to talk a little bit about cyber liability, primarily from the insurance perspective. There's no doubt that the internet has revolutionized our way of life, both on a personal level as well as a business level. Back in 1998, then Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan coined the term a new economy when we were talking about the technology revolution, but I don't think he ever really had in mind what we're talking about now in terms of the transformation of our economy from bricks and mortar to clicks and order. From an e-commerce perspective, we can be on the internet and perform tasks anywhere at any time. There are more than 1.5 billion websites and growing, and the pandemic, the impact of which we're only beginning to experience, has basically, according to preliminary statistics, increased online sales from approximately 590 billion to more than 700 billion year over year. So there is no doubt that the new economy is one that is going to continue to be rapidly changing, and it's going to be here to stay. So with a new economy means we run into new risk exposures and complications for businesses, one of which the initial problem we ran into with these new online risks was the fact that the general liability policy was not built to deal with the risks that were associated with cyber-related concerns. We've had issues with data theft becoming commonplace, particularly among the young. They seem to be the least concerned about things like identity theft. Copyright and trademark infringement, which used to be more of a concern in the publishing realm, all of a sudden became an issue when we were publishing online, and there were questions about what constitutes a publisher. If I put a publication on my website, does that mean I'm in the publishing business? And there are limitations in policies surrounding those type of circumstances. And then there are the employment related concerns. We have situations where employees will use software that hasn't been tested, that we don't know how secure it is. There's basically a situation where they will inadvertently comment about things on social media, which creates concerns about libel and slander. So with that, we have greater economic risk to companies that are working online. And these are just some examples of some of these. Trademark infringement, which is unauthorized linking and registering a domain name that you don't have the consent to do. Copyright implications, using other people's materials without credit and without licensing those materials. Intellectual property rights, which is who owns what, basically, and who owns the content that you're talking about. Defamation, where you're defaming someone's character. Libel, slander, security breaches, privacy-related concerns, systems failures, viruses, denial of service attacks. All of these things are things that either companies didn't have prior to getting online, or they had a minimal exposure to it that all of a sudden became a whole lot greater because they were doing business online. Another potential risk that people were running into is situations with their employees. Privacy concerns, both from the perspective of employees asserting that an employer who was either reading their email or was limiting sites that they could go to, that was a violation of their privacy. There were issues already in the business world with issues like sexual harassment. And this cyber world brought in things like cyberbullying as an issue, as well as just adding another layer of concern over things like discrimination and sexual harassment suits. And then you had social media, basically concerns over what your employees may be saying about your competitors and what your competitors may be saying about you. There are concerns in regards to truth and what's real and what's not. And those situations can lead to significant lawsuits surrounding things like personal injury. So the insurance industry's response to all this is cyber coverage. And basically, this is a policy that is built for any company that has a web presence at all, whether it's e-commerce or not. And usually the policy is built into 3 separate coverage parts. The first party part being the damage that a company itself suffers. For instance, your website's brought down and you suffer a loss of revenue because people can't access it, or the cost that you may incur for notifying parties if there is a data breach and you need to comply with data breach laws that the state you're operating in. Third party is for damages to other parties, and that would be things like media liability, libel and slander situations. Copyright infringement is something that falls into that, as well as the privacy and security of data issue. And then the third component is the cybercrime coverage. And this includes things that have become very, very much a problem these days, which are ransomware and cyber extortion. It also includes social engineering, which was something that Jim just referenced. The policies are generally rated off of either revenue or the number of potential records that are accessible to someone. The typical policy features are basically this. First and foremost, there is no off-the-shelf product. This can differ significantly from one insurance carrier to another. And every insurance carrier has a different form and a different structure. So it's something that you basically have to keep in mind, is that one policy isn't necessarily the same in comparison to another. The policies are written on a claims-made basis, which means that the policy that is in force at the time a claim is made is the policy that's going to respond. And that differs from an occurrence policy, which is basically the policy that responds is the one that was in place when the actual act that led to the claim occurred. Claims-made policy brings a little bit more certainty to the insurance carrier actuaries in terms of building rates, and eliminates what we in the industry call a long tail situation. The policies are written on a duty to defend basis, which means that irregardless of whether or not a suit has merit, if it's fraudulent or not, the insurance carrier is obligated to defend you or the owner of the policy as a result of that. Then defense costs are inside the limit of insurance, which means that the defense of a lawsuit, which is usually the biggest part of any claim, will apply against the limit of insurance. So it doesn't provide you an unlimited amount of defense coverage like you would get under a general liability policy. The policy defending a lawsuit under this policy will erode the limits of insurance. So you need to keep in mind that aspect as you choose what limit of insurance you may want for your policy. Typical exclusions you'd run into are things like bodily injury and property damage, and that's generally because those are the domain of a general liability policy. Telecommunications infrastructure that's outside your control. This has become more of an issue with calls like this, Zoom calls, and situations where if there's an outage and it is basically something that is as a result of a hack of your computer systems, there'd be coverage in the policy. But if it's something that there's a hacking problem with, say, a company like Zoom who's providing the service, that wouldn't necessarily be covered under the policy. And that's something you might have to work through other venues of, such as risk transfer within the contract. Professional liability and errors and omissions are usually excluded, and that's because that's generally more what you would find in a true technology, an information technology, a software developing type company, as opposed to just your standard company who is building a website and maybe doing some e-commerce. The bottom line is there needs to be a very careful review of the policy language to make sure you know exactly what is covered and what is being excluded. The final thought I'd like to leave everybody with is that the average cost of a data breach in 2019 was $149,000. And the average cost of a cyber attack was $200,000. These figures have only increased, and as a result of the pandemic, for instance, the FBI just indicated recently that they will be investigating double the amount of cyber-related crime that they had been investigating a year ago. The pandemic has opened up a whole new avenue for hackers to be able to do damage, and do things like ransomware to companies that have people working at home where security maybe isn't necessarily as stringent as it might be under other circumstances.
Wow. Thank you very much, John. I will apologize ahead of time. My security is barking at my neighbor at this point. So if you hear a loud bark, that's my security. John, I do have one question for you that came up. Do we need special insurance, like a special insurance rider or something, specifically for a work from home environment?
Fortunately, particularly with the rise of the pandemic and the fact that these things came on so quickly and there was a need to pivot very quickly from a work-in environment to a work-at-home type scenario, the insurance carriers have broadly interpreted things like the coverage territory of the policy and where coverage would actually be covered at that point. Even in like workers' comp insurance, which is a little different, obviously, than what we're talking about today, but there are specific classifications that have been filed specifically to cover telecommuting employees, as opposed to those who may have been doing more work outside of an office as opposed to inside of one. And the rates reflect that. There's a lot less chance of an injury if you're just working really at home than if you're out and about and driving in a car from one appointment to another.
Okay. And then one last question. What's the average amount that's been paid out for a ransomware attack?
That is an interesting question. And it's certainly on the rise as a result of the pandemic. The average 2 years ago was $200,000. And I can tell you that it's got to be far greater than that now, given the circumstances that we're in, the number of incidents involving cyber extortion and ransomware are just growing exponentially because of the pandemic. And the fact that, working from home, you just don't have the same potential level of security as you do maybe in another environment.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to take just a moment and bring in Pete Spellos for some comments before we move to Brian. Pete?
Thank you. Thanks, John. That was great. When I saw John's presentation, I thought there was one important thing to add to it, and that's the expertise that your insurance carrier can bring should you suffer a cyber event. I've had the opportunity to work a major cyber event, and for me, it was a new thing that I don't do every day. For the insurance company and their people, it was something they do for a living. So having that insurance carrier, it's important because they bring expertise to the table if you have an event.
Yeah, that's definitely part of what you're buying when you buy the policy, is the fact that if you didn't have that, you'd have to figure that out yourself. And how do you figure out who's the right person to be able to help you deal with notifying parties because of a data breach, et cetera. So the service you get with it and the support behind the claims process is very important.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much. All righty. Well, to wrap everything up, we've got Brian Weaver.
Well, thank you so much, Della. So what I'd like to do is, talking about ransomware, is initially start with discussing some of the trends that we're seeing, especially during 2020, of course, during the pandemic. There were some very big shifts that took place. The bad guys that are out there certainly will take advantage of any environment or any opportunity that comes their way. So ransomware actually increased by an amazing 77% in the first 3 months of the pandemic. Again, with companies having employees work from home, an environment that many companies were not used to, it opened up vulnerabilities within organizations. And of course, the bad guys are looking to take advantage of that. A lot of those vulnerabilities still exist today with a number of companies. And to John's point, there's been significant increases throughout all of 2020 and into 2021 with ransomware attacks. And as companies shift more to a SaaS environment or a hosted environment, we're seeing the ransomware focus in those areas as well, of course, because that's where a lot of the business is going, and that's where these guys are going as well. And if you look to the major hosting providers that are out there, Amazon Web Services, Azure from Microsoft, Rackspace, etc. They have SLAs around uptime for applications, but there is no element of data protection. And that's because that's something that they're not able to do securely. And it's important that every company takes responsibility for ensuring that their data is protected. It's kind of interesting. I was laughing when Jim had mentioned about a lot of the phishing attacks that occur. That's the fastest growing area of attacks. Phishing emails, 50% of all business people have had some incident or some experience with a phishing attack that's been successful. That sounds astronomical to me, but the reason for that is that there are new ways that, that through social engineering and so forth, that these phishing incidents look far more personal than they ever have before. And it's very easy to get fooled by them. Jim had also mentioned whaling. And one of my favorite whaling stories, I just mentioned it briefly, it's not one that's very recent, but it happened about a year and a half ago, was with Alcoa. Alcoa's board of directors. It may have been something that some people have heard about. There was an attack that went out from the chairman of the board on agenda update to all of the board members. And that went out on an email that was one letter off of the chairman's email address, which of course people didn't catch. You opened up that agenda document and of course immediately downloaded ransomware into several very large organizations. So one of the most successful whaling attacks of recent times that took place. One of the other big changes, which is incredibly disturbing, but it's something that people need to be aware of, is the tactics that ransomware attacks are taking these days. In the old days, the ransomware developers used to be smaller guys, working in their basements and so forth, a handful of folks. They'd send in a ransomware attack, they'd get able to infect a company, lock down data and say, okay, pay me X amount of money. And that'd be the end of it. There's two things that are changing. One is what we like to call infect and wait. So when they attack now, they're not simply locking down data. They want to get to your customers and they want to get to your vendors. So they can attach executables to documents and so forth, electronic documents. If you send out electronic invoices or purchase orders to your customers and vendors and other documents as well, and communications, that's all in play. And once they're done and think that they've gotten about as much out of a company as they possibly can, now they lock down your data, as they've already infected all the folks that you do business with. So kind of scary, and at the same time, it's becoming far more damaging out there, not only for companies, but also reputations of organizations as well. One of the things I like to do is talk a little bit about the threat groups. So a lot of times when we think about a ransomware attack, the most common thing we think about is ransomware developers, of course, and that was the original way that ransomware infections took place. But there are other players as well. So organized crime has gotten very heavy into ransomware as well. And organized crime tends to have far more resources than many of the ransomware developers do. Alongside that, a lot of inside threats are taking place as well. If you think about a disgruntled employee that may get fired, they can do an incredible amount of damage. There's actually espionage that takes place within organizations as well, especially larger organizations where people are paid to be able to gather information and harness infections and things of that nature. And one of the larger threats that's come out in probably the last 8 to 10 years is nation states. And some of them rise to the top of the list that are fairly well known. So you've got Russia, you have China, you have North Korea, and number 4 would be Nigeria. So those are the primary nation states that actually fund ransomware attacks and fund different ways in which they can steal data from organizations. So one needs to ask, how at risk might my company be? So Jim actually talked about a number of things that is what I'll call the old way that folks would protect themselves. When I say the old way, it doesn't mean it's bad. They're still important that you do those things, but you've got to do more. So you look at antivirus and malware protection, incredibly important to do, but you've got to do more than that. Firewalls, making sure your firewalls are in place, especially if you have on-prem solutions, and then VPN as well. And Jim talked about all three of those, all very important to do. However, there's additional things that are required as well. So you have to be aware that there's advanced threat education that needs to take place. We talked about social engineering phishing attacks. Your employees more than ever need to be informed as to how to look for those types of things. Jim had some great examples that he showed that are very easy to fool people if people aren't made aware of what might be out there and the types of things to look for. So educating your staff is extremely important, especially in terms of phishing emails. It only takes one click, one employee, one time to let something in. I always like to say, people refer to ransomware as an attack. It's really not an attack. It's an open door or an invitation to come into my company inadvertently, but it's an invitation. I have to let them in some way. So we want to try to prevent that from happening. Multi-factor authentication, very important. I was kind of laughing because of some of the password comments that have been made. It's scary what people do and how accessible passwords are. And I think, we all do it to some degree. You have a password that you want to try to remember and you use it for lots of different things. Okay, so it's important that you have a proper password protocols in place, and multi-factor authentication is a good way to do that as well. You want to have password management. People find it a bit of a pain to, all of a sudden have an application that makes you change your password every so often. But it's important that you do that, okay? So that, someone doesn't get a hold of your password and they can use that anywhere. It's important to look at technical advanced detection capabilities. So there's some tools out there these days that allow for advanced detection. It allows you to be proactive and be able to take action against a ransomware attack or an infection that's taking place before you actually get locked down. And there's ways that can happen. And then finally, a business continuity plan. So everything I've talked about up to now is about minimizing risk, right? Trying to reduce the chance of being infected by ransomware. But if you do get infected by ransomware, you have to have an action plan to be able to quickly recover. So that's your last gasp, that's your last piece, if you will, that you have to have as part of your overall business continuity plan, is to be able to recover quickly. So those are the things that we need to look at these days when we're considering risk. So there's 5 key cybersecurity areas that one needs to look at. So first is the ability to identify where attacks may be coming from. And we talked about several of those today. The ability to protect, where am I vulnerable and how can I protect those areas? The ability to detect. So I have to have tools and the ability to know that I'm being attacked and how those detect what's taking place. And then be able to respond to it. What's my response to those attacks that take place? And then finally recover. So those are the pieces that are most important that we do. Now, I have several examples of ransomware attacks that occurred towards the tail end of 2020. I could talk about that for an hour alone, but I took some examples that I want to share with you. But before I do that, Della, is there any questions that we might have out there up to this point?
There's a couple of them. One is, do you have an example of advanced threat detection?
Yeah, Della, so that's a great question. So if you think of a way that I can somehow detect ransomware before it occurs, all the folks on this call are ERP users, right? And ERP is a great solution to be able to do that detection. So if you think of master files that are normally relatively static, right? Item masters, vendor masters, customer masters, it's rare that I'm in there making much changes to those, right? If there's high levels of activity on those accounts, that's a detection. That's a red flag that goes up that tells me, you know what, something's going on. Maybe there's ransomware that is attaching an executable to all my customers and vendors and items, et cetera. So that's a really good example of an advanced detection capability that might exist.
Oh, okay. What is the quickest way to recover from a ransomware open door?
Yeah, so that's a great question as well. So it's all about recovery time, the ability to detect and then recover. And the best way to do that is to have a snapshot, what they refer to as snapshot systems, which is not only backing up your data, but it's actually taking a full snapshot of your entire environment, your operating system, your applications, your security access as well. So it's recovering all of those things at one time. If you only recover your data, which is kind of the old way that people used to do, with tapes and that kind of thing, you still need to reload your operating system and reload all your applications, so forth. All that stuff takes time. Whereas if you have a snapshot of your environment, you can bring it up within minutes and recover.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So what I'll do now is I'll share just some interesting examples of some of the ways that the bad guys are out there trying to find ways to be able to infect companies, and some of the rather clever things that they've actually done. So I'm going to work backwards. I'm going to start with December of 2020. And the one example I've got that I'm going to use there is Habana Labs. Habana Labs is an artificial intelligence lab of Intel Corporation. So pretty well-known company for making chips and so forth. And they have a lab for artificial intelligence. Smart folks, right? And yet they were attacked by ransomware. They were able to find that within the artificial intelligence engine of their organization, there was a ransomware that was embedded within their system. So that was, I thought, kind of interesting, kind of humorous at the same time. Barnes & Noble, November of 2020, their Nook accounts. Okay, so if you think about the Nook accounts that you might have with Barnes & Noble, infected tens of thousands of customers, or put them at risk at least, on their accounts, because obviously to create your own Nook account, you have to have personalized data, etc. So that was something that happened in November. United Healthcare Services, so big healthcare company. We talked about infect and wait. This is a great example. So they were infected with ransomware for months, but the ransomware folks didn't pull the trigger in terms of locking them down. Why? Because they wanted to go after the hospitals. So as employees with those healthcare, with that company as their healthcare provider, were in hospitals, they needed to access electronic information and so forth from those patients. And the hospitals got infected as a result. Now, the brass ring for a lot of these ransomware folks truly is hospitals and other healthcare organizations. Why? Because the HIPAA laws are so expensive if you happen to violate or breach that. If you let out customer information, the fines can be astronomical. The bad guys know this, so they don't look to even lock down the data of the hospitals. They just simply say, we'll release it. We'll release that information. You'll have HIPAA fines in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, or you can pay me $150,000 to $200,000 and take care of this and make it go away. And that was in September of last year. This one is really sad, frankly. US fertility. Poor folks looking to get pregnant and have a baby. You think about all the sensitive information that they must have to have on file, right, to be able to be part of this fertility clinic. And that was one that was infected in September of last year as well. And finally, nations are not immune either. Argentina's immigration services was attacked in August. So those are just some examples of the different types of attacks that can take place. It's not just the large organizations that come after the smaller ones as well.
No.
And Della, with that, I'll put it back to you.
Well, thank you very much. I do have a couple of questions. One I've got for John. Let's talk about special events. Everything being digital, everything being virtual. Do we need to have cyber insurance if we're having a digital event?
It's an interesting question. It's kind of an evolving situation. The special event market, primarily the event cancellation portion of it, which is for situations where usually an organization will put on an event and it'll be, attended by individuals, and they have a revenue that could be lost if that event doesn't come off. Right. And there's insurance for that. Now that a lot of folks are going towards virtual events where they're basically going to try to hold a similar type event, but it's going to be totally virtual. There's not going to be physical attendance at a spot. It's going to all be done like this. And, when you read the policy language, I had discussions with several insurance carriers about this, there are limitations in those policies surrounding, for instance, if there was a hack that was done and the event couldn't go off because somebody had hacked into equipment. If it's equipment that's owned by the organization that has their own cyber policy, there is potentially coverage for that. But if it's a hack in the hosting company for them, it's the equipment that they don't own, it's owned by their hosting company, could be Zoom is an example, that's not covered under a cyber policy because it's really out of your realm of control. And right now, there is no mechanism insurance-wise to actually cover that type of scenario. It has to be addressed primarily through other risk management means. For instance, making sure that you're using a reputable company who does this and not some fly-by-night operation that's just getting into it because there's a buck to be made by being able to be a digital event hoster. And then the other part of it is through the contract provisions and having some sort of stipulations in the contract that outline exactly what's going to happen under those circumstances. And the hope being that when you have that contract written, that there'll be the ability to recoup losses if there's something that happens and Zoom gets hacked.
Wow. Okay. It's opened up a whole new world. It really has,
It certainly has,
Okay.
and that was a marketplace that I did a lot of business in because I write a lot of nonprofit organizations, and now it's basically all but dried up, and these carriers are trying to figure out how they're going to write policies that deal with a virtual audience.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, with the world being virtual now, everything has totally changed. So I have one last question for the panel, just a real quick one because we're running long here. One of the things that I hear from my people are, why in the world would anybody worry about us? Why would anybody hack us? We're just a little company, of no consequence to anybody. Why do we need to worry about it? So I'm going to just open this up to the panel. I'll start with Jim. Just a quick comment on why should I worry? You're on mute. Jim, you're on mute.
Thank you, Della. Look at that. So essentially, why not was my answer. It's like sometimes not after $200,000. Some of the small players are after a little amount of money, but they just want to cause havoc. They're just out there because it's sort of like riding down the street, in the old days when we were teenagers and then causing a problem. And there are different reasons that hacking occurs, and not all of them is to get the biggest bang for the buck. And those sometimes are the most disruptive types of hacks.
Okay. Pete?
So yeah, Jim's 100% right. And the thing to be clear about is they're not trying to get you. They're simply scanning the internet. And you just happen to be on the internet. So this is what these people do for a living. They come on work on Monday morning and they sit down and they just look for somebody to break into. If you happen to be the unlucky person, it doesn't matter if you're selling widgets or if you're selling thingamabobs, they're going to get you. Now, obviously, some people like the Defense Department or the State Department are targets, but for the rest of us, we're just kind of drive-by hacking.
Oh, yeah. Oh, great. A drive-by hacking. That's wonderful. Something else to look forward to. Brian?
Yeah, so it's a game of numbers. So the more folks that they can infect, the better. And smaller organizations tend to not be as protected, and they tend not to have educated their people adequately and so forth. And the phishing attacks tend to be more successful in the smaller organizations that take place.
Okay. And then John.
Just to piggyback on what Brian was just talking about, basically what happens is Target and these Fortune 500 companies get all the news headlines when they're hacked, but they have millions of dollars in personnel that are there to deal with those issues. A small business person doesn't. A small business person's trying to do, make a living. If it's a bakery, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to, make the best rolls and bagels and have somebody come to my place. They're not thinking about, I need to have security because I'm getting into an e-commerce environment at that point. And they just don't have the resources. And so ultimately, many hackers are just going to go for an easy target. Why spend a lot of time going after, somebody who's going to put up all sorts of defenses when I can just go after, the mom and pop shop who probably has virtually none.
No. And that's a very good point. Now, if you guys, if the audience is like I am, I'm going to come up with 100 different questions after this whole thing is over. So we will put out on the forums. If you have questions, just put them out on the forum. we're going to share the emails of the panelists so that you can contact them directly. You don't have to put the question, but I'm going to direct you out to the forum to ask any question that you've got. All righty. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for all of your information. We're going to turn it back over to Gloria.
Thank you. And I'm unmuting myself. Thank you, Della. Pete, Jim, John, Brian, and let's see, who did I miss? Jim.
Pete.
Pete, thank you. Thank you so much. You were just great this afternoon. And a quick reminder, if you still have any questions, please post them, as Della said, to the forum. And also wanted to remind you that our TUG Connects live registration is up there. And also mark your calendars, because on Tuesday this coming week, EnlightenNet is going to share their docs and AP automation tools for all of our TUG users, regardless of ERP, and that's at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So again, TUG registration is open. Go over and register today. And also, for those of you who are not yet members, Della is talking about the forum. This particular recording is going to be behind the membership wall. So you'll need to have a membership if you want to be able to attach yourself to any of those items that are behind our membership wall now that we've transferred some of our platforms over. So now you have it. If you're not a member, go to www.theusergroup.org and join today. It's worth it for the price of admission on those forum boards alone. So without any further ado, as they say in Hollywood, folks, that's a wrap.